the Ballast Water Management Act. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has signed the Ballast Water Management Convention from 2004. However, we have not been faithful to that agreement because we have not passed in our Parliament the Ballast Water Management Act. And today is a historic day that we will be passing, hopefully, that act. Ballast water, Mr. Speaker, is carried into ships to maintain their stability and trim when they are being operated at sea in an empty or partially laden state. And the Ballast Water Management Convention of 2004 was adopted by the International Maritime Organization to provide a global legal framework for the regulation and management of a ship's ballast water and the sediments which remain in the tanks of the vessels after the ballast water has been discharged. Mr. Speaker, when especially our bauxite vessels or vessels that carry bulk cargo are operating from one port to the other and are empty, it is the practice that you take. In the old days, they used to take on stones to ballast the ship, to steady it in the rough seas. But over time, water has been used to ballast it. But what you find, Mr. Speaker, is that they discharge this water in our ports, and in the water are foreign species, and you can have contamination. There is a very, very strange case, I would call, of cholera being introduced into a port because they took on the water from one to another. The new convention, Mr. Speaker, asks that you take up the ballast water from the home port, and once you hit international water, it is discharged, and you take up international water. And when you get into the visiting port, you discharge the ballast water. But a lot of ships are not, Mr. Speaker, following the rules and the regulations, and Jamaica, having signed on to the treaty, also has to pass the necessary laws to give effect to the treaty. Approximately 10 billion tons of ballast water are being transferred globally on an annual basis, and approximately 10,000 species, including invasive aquatic species, are being carried each day in the ballast tanks of ships. The transfer of invasive aquatic species in the ballast has contributed to the collapse of fisheries, the increased risk of the spread of cholera, shellfish poisoning in humans, and increased maintenance costs on the part of power-generating plants due to the fouling of their intake cooling pipes. In Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, the introduction of Asian green mussels found in the Kingston Harbor has been identified by the University of the West Indies as having been introduced into Jamaican waters via ballast water. Having regard to Jamaica's container transshipment activities, because, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica gets approximately 2,400 ship calls per year, and that is increasing. And each time a ship comes, you are at risk of being contaminated. The export of bulk cargo such as bauxite and alumina and aggregate, ships calling at Jamaican ports discharge their ballast water prior to the loading operation. Jamaica is therefore at risk of having invasive aquatic species being introduced into our maritime environment, as well as pathogens such as cholera being introduced into the country. Additionally, with the widening of the Panama Canal, the dredging of the Kingston Transshipment Terminal, and the recent opening of the bauxite plant in Nain, large foreign flag vessels currently trade with Jamaican ports and transit our territorial waters. The legislation will be administered by the Maritime Authority of Jamaica, which operates an international ship registry and a mega yacht registry. Mr. Speaker, in explaining the legislation, I'll do it in parts. Part one defines the legislation. The scope of the legislation extends to Jamaican ships anywhere they are in the world and foreign flag ships in Jamaican waters. Jamaican waters are interpreted to extend to our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. The Maritime Authority, through the Director General, will be responsible for ensuring that both Jamaican and foreign flag ships comply with the legislation. Excluded from the application are ships which are designed not to carry ballast water, operate solely in restricted areas, as well as Jamaican government ships operated for non-commercial purposes. Part 2, Mr. Speaker, treats with the control and management of ships' ballast water and sediments. Ships are required to carry on board a ballast water management plan and a ballast water record book. The prescribed form of the record book is in the schedule to the bill. Additionally, ships based on their date of construction and the size of their ballast water tanks are required to exchange their ballast water in accordance with the legislation or install ballast water treatment systems which will prevent, reduce, or eliminate invasive species and pathogens. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, a part of the convention speaks to that the next time a ship goes to dry dock, they are required to fit a ballast water treatment system onto the ship. So it is said that within 8 to 10 years, all ships operating will have some kind of ballast water treatment system. A number of ship owners, however, have calculated that the system costs approximately $5 million US. And those that have older ships, what they are doing is upgrading the ships or just abandoning those ships and buy new ships. So we are ensuring with this piece of legislation that we adhere to the convention that we had signed, but we never had the domestic law to enforce the provisions of the convention. The bill requires that the director notifies masters or owners about the areas where the uptake of ballast water is prohibited. This is very important, Mr. Speaker, because of where Jamaica is situated. While our exclusive zone goes up to 200 nautical miles out, we do have the situation where we have neighboring countries closer than the 200 miles. And the convention asks that in that case, because our closest neighbor is 90 miles, which is Cuba, and then you have Haiti, which is pretty close, that 50 nautical miles should be the limit, or if you are closer than that, then predetermined sections in the ocean where the water is at least 200 meters deep ought to be used to take on ballast water before you carry that water into a home port. It is suspected by some people, but we have no definitive proof. Part 3, surveyors, surveys, and survey certificates. Control over Jamaican ships is exercised through the survey of the ships at specified periods and at the issuance of a certificate evidencing that the ship has the equipment, the ballast water record book, and a ballast water management plan. The form of the International Ballast Water Management Certificate is also set out in the schedule to the bill. The surveys of Jamaican ships will be conducted by surveyors appointed by the Maritime Authority of Jamaica and by classification societies such as Lloyd's Register of Shipping, which have been approved by the Maritime Authority. Surveyors have the authority to withdraw certificates from Jamaican ships which are not compliant. In Part 4, in the case of foreign ships in Jamaican waters, inspectors of the Maritime Authority of Jamaica may board these ships to determine whether they are in compliance with the legislation. The enforcement powers of the inspectors include detention of the ships until the discrepancies found have been rectified, the warning of the ship, or the exclusion of a non-compliant ship from our harbors or waters. Where the action of the inspector causes undue delays, the ship owner is entitled to compensation for any loss or damage incurred. Part 5, the sediment receptacle facilities. When ships pump ballast water in their tanks, the sediments in the water settle and over time accumulate in the bottom of the tank. The sediments may contain invasive aquatic species or pathogens, and the legislation provides for the establishment of sediment reception facilities to receive and treat these sediments. Penalties. The bill provides for penalties not exceeding 30 million Jamaican dollars for discharging ballast water in breach of the provisions, and not exceeding 10 million Jamaican dollars for failing to produce a ballast water record book or making false entries into the book. The bill also gives the minister the power to introduce by affirmative resolution increases in the various fines. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House for its consideration and approval at the appropriate time.